All right, Chapter 8. Chapter 8 is the chapter that deals with the notion of language and culture. And language is something people frequently underestimate in terms of having the ability to influence your perception and your concept of reality. Some of the things discussed in this chapter are functions, the idea of language and meaning, language and culture, different things regarding using language, and as well as interpreting and translating, and communication technology, as well as competence. This discussion of using language here, predominantly what that is going to relate to is the idea, well, your textbook is going to go into some specific languages. And in this section, I will probably shut off the webcam altogether and simply scroll through the rest of this particular PowerPoint, because there's a lot of detail on the PowerPoint slides, and so you can certainly stop and take notes and review. So we'll go quickly. It's just one way to keep this particular chapter lecture a little bit on the shorter side. So let's dive in. Talking about the functions of language, here predominantly we're dealing with the notion of social interaction, and that just has to do with a lot of the functionality and what we go through, the daily use of language, whether that's getting change for a dollar, whether that's getting directions, etc. Social cohesion has to do with the sense of community and ends up being very critical. And identity. Your language has a lot to do with your concept of who you are, particularly your national identity. The United States does not have a national language, and there's been a lot of debate over that. And so if you look at some of that debate, you sort of see the idea and the power of language. Language and meaning. What is language? Language is, by the definition at the bottom of page 247 in your textbook, but it's basically a set of shared symbols or sign that a cooperative group of people has mutually agreed upon to help them create meaning. So symbols and signs. Language is merely a representation for something else. And if you've ever felt a little frustrated with the inadequacy of language, then you've experienced some of that symbolic nature of language. Symbols and their meaning are often arbitrary. In other words, it's randomly assigned. That's not necessarily a whole lot of logic or a lot of connection between the language and the symbol that it represents. The discussion of language variations is where you get into the idea of accent, of dialect, of argot, and jargon. And there are, or rather slang is the third one. There are a lot of interesting research on the idea of language variations. The field is called etymology, and if you really want to get into it, it gets pretty interesting. I'm going to show you a small audio clip. I believe it's next in the learning unit, where it sort of stresses how subtle the differences are in accent and how that can completely change the meaning in other languages. Conversational taboos, these are certain sort of hot topics, things that aren't necessarily culturally talked about. And it varies from place to place. Obviously, obvious ones would be things like sex and, things like that. But there are other cultures where it's not appropriate for you to ask, how's your family? Because that's a conversational taboo. So that's what that is in reference to. The idea of synergy between language and culture, that has to do with the influence and the role that language has on perception, and that, some initial quotes that you might read in the book, for example, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and some sort of quotes that go along with that is the idea that, quote, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. That type of thing, really stressing the notion the language influences your worldview and your perception far more than you can even begin to comprehend and understand. And in terms of the culture's language or vocabulary, emphasizing what's important. A simple example, I think, would illustrate this. Think about how many words you can come up with for snow. And maybe it's 4 or 5. I'm not sure how many. It probably depends if you're an avid skier or snowboarder. But it's been said that in traditional Eskimo language, in that tribal language, they have over 27 different words that illustrate snow, and you don't. And I don't. In classical Arabic, there are over 2,000 ways to refer to a camel. And I'm not sure how many you can come up with, but I'm sure it's a far cry from 2,000. And yet if I were to ask you, I took my blank to the shop, meaning your car, your vehicle, your automobile, start throwing in brand names. For example, I drive a Toyota, so it's an import. It's a RAV4, so it's a mini SUV. It's what year is it? 2006, and it's an automatic. I call it Betsy or whatever. And literally, we could take each type of vehicle and probably come up with 5 or 6 names for that particular type of vehicle. And then I could even throw in logos. And if I were to simply flash the logo for a Toyota, you would know what that means. So that's the idea that within our culture, the concept of the automobile or of the vehicle is extremely important, and therefore our language has a myriad of different words that can denote that particular object. Now I want to get into the section that talks about using language, and here I'm going to go relatively quickly, and this is specific cultural differences in language, and your book talks about Spanish language, and you can look at this. These are some of the highlights. Northeast Asian, which encompasses several different countries. Arabic, very interesting given today's society. And then the English language. So lastly, the chapter closes with the discussion of interpreting and translating. And this has a lot to do with the idea that there is a difference between interpretation and translation. Interpretation frequently has to do with oral communication. Translation has to do with written communication. Signed communication, by the way, for example, like ASL type thing, can be either interpretation or translation. And then it gives some suggestion, the chapter gives some suggestions on working with interpreters and translators and how that works. And then, as always, this chapter closes with the section on competence and how to become more interculturally competent and how to improve that. And there you have 5 suggestions for improving this from a language point of view, and that is being very mindful, being very aware, far more than you are normally. To be considerate of your speech rate and the rate in which you communicate your language, of the terms in which you use, that you avoid things like argot and jargon, that you are closely attuned to your nonverbal behaviors, things that might not be at all significant within an English culture, an American culture, have profound meaning in a culture that is high context. And checking is the idea of feedback and things like that. Developing a second language is important, and some of the benefits are listed there. A joke that I've often heard that unfortunately is sadly true is that of which it goes like this. What do you call somebody who speaks 2 languages? Okay, bilingual. What do you call someone who speaks 3 languages? Trilingual. What do you call someone who speaks 1 language? American. Sad, but certainly true. So the more you can begin to grasp that, even basic fundamental words in another language is very beneficial to you. So that's it for now. It's about 9 minutes. We got through this relatively fast, and I'll see you online.